There we go. Okay. All right. So hello, Evolve and Ascend. So we are going live tonight with Jenn Zahrt. So welcome to Astrology Rocks, a Q&A live stream with Neural Learning. And so Neural Learning is an online community for transformational learning, interesting courses for interesting people. We explore topics such as human potential, transpersonal psychology, astrology, philosophy, and the mystery and nature of consciousness. So Dr. Jenn Zahrt is joining us today, and she's here to talk about her upcoming class with Neura, Astrology Rocks. It's an online 2-hour seminar happening next Thursday, March 15th at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard. I believe that's 4:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And she's here also to answer your questions on astrology, about how certain stones are connected to the signs of the zodiac and planets and other astrological factors. So be sure to type your astrology-related questions in the Facebook Live comment section. So just punch your questions in, and we're going to be reading those as we go along tonight during the session. We're going to go about an hour. So Jenn Zahrt writes about the history, philosophy, and epistemology of astrology, with a special focus on the German cultural realm. Her doctoral thesis was titled The Astrological Imaginary, I love that imaginary word, in early 20th century Germany, and it concerns the ways in which astrology shaped philosophy and literature and the arts during the Weimar Republic. Since 2007, Zahrt has worked as a professional editor for the interdisciplinary humanities journal Representations, the Literary Arts Quarterly, Threepenny Review, academic journal Culture and Cosmos. In 2014, she co-founded Rubido Press, and she is the creative director of Sophia Center Press. And in 2017, she founded Revelor Press, of which I am also co-editor. Yay. A recognized expert in the field of cultural history of astrology, Jenn has taught and lectured domestically and internationally in places such as Germany, the UK, and Canada. And I believe you're currently working on translating works from German astrologers into English and working on a book titled Strategies of Legitimacy, Astrological Polemics in Pre-World War II Germany. And you also have your client base in Seattle, Washington, and that's where you're located. So welcome, Jenn Zahrt, and thanks for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Jeremy. That was a resounding welcome. You sort of went through everything. And thanks for also welcoming me to teach at Neura. I'm very excited about the class next week.
Yeah, so let's kind of jump right into that. So first of all, it's an interesting subject, and I think a lot of people would be very curious to kind of learn about how these things are connected, right? But maybe the first thing we can get into is an interview that we did a few months ago on how and what astrology is to you, first of all, sort of like defining that and understanding it. And you told me that it's a storytelling technology. Could you maybe explain what you meant by that?
I think if I had to have like 2 seconds in an elevator with somebody to talk to them about what astrology is and leave them with something to get their juices flowing and thinking about it differently, I always start with the word itself. So if we say astrology, it sounds like a singular noun, and all of these practices must somehow be conjoined into one type of thing, right? So you say astrology and you think it must be one thing. And the broadest definition of astrology would be meaningful relationships established between celestial phenomena and earthly phenomena. But every single culture has come up with different ways to establish that meaningful relationship, almost to the point of being an entirely different practice. So the thing they have in common is that they're relating something happening in the sky to something happening on Earth. But different cultures use different math, and they use different ways of, permutating that math and different points of reference. Sometimes they use the path of the sun along the yearly progression of its, movement in the sky as a reference point. And then other cultures use a different reference point. And so you get variations on a theme, and yet none of them are related in terms of a kind of evolution. They're intersections. Some cultures take things from other cultures and remix them and come up with new things. But to think of like it got born in Babylon and then now we've got sun sign horoscopes is a very simplistic way of understanding it. So I always like to think of it as, humans, we live on Earth, the sun rises and sets, we have mythologies and religions that get built up about that. And so in the realm of astrology, we have different ways of understanding ourselves by looking at the mirror of the sky and looking at what's happening in the sky relating that to what's happening on Earth. And so, from the anthropological approach, these different techniques actually end up telling us more about the culture that came up with them than they do about whether they're true or the nature of reality. And I find that to be the most interesting thing, is that, if one culture is really all about Venus, that's going to tell you a lot about them, as opposed to telling you necessarily anything objective about Venus. And, you mentioned strategies of legitimacy. There seems to be a desire with people who are learning astrology to somehow prove it or convince other people that it works, because they've suddenly had that aha moment where they get into some of it and they realize, wow, this really does help me understand myself. And the story that science wants to tell about the world is very different than the stories that astrology can tell us about the world. So astrology doesn't need to answer to science in that way. I like the quote by Patrick Curry when he said, astrology isn't a failed version of something, it's itself. And so every time I try to teach anything related to astrology, I try to help promote that idea that here we have something that human beings have come up with consistently across various cultures, and we can appreciate it for its own merits. And we don't need to compare it to religion. We don't need to compare it to science. We can learn about it. And we can learn about it in a very specific context, whether that's the modern Western context, the Arabic era context, or Hellenistic Greece, or even India, or, the Mayan cultures. So, yeah.
Great answer. Great, great and concise answer there. So here we're going to be talking next week, right, about the connection between astrology, right, and rocks and stones. And you mentioned in the description that idea that stones are basically, living things, right? So maybe we can kind of go into this kind of, because I feel like there's a kind of emergent cosmology here, right? Like in terms of seeing the universe as sort of a living thing and recognizing that and honoring that and learning how to kind of work with those things. So without spoiling the class, maybe just a little bit, can you talk a little bit about that connection between stones and stars?
Yeah, I will go back to an anecdote I heard from Magenta, who is the CEO of Loom Network. She and I were friends in the Bay Area when we lived there, and I know you worked with her when she was at Evolver. And during some of the time hanging out, she said, she was just kind of appreciating how human beings are this fantastic biological crystal. And when she said that, that really got my mind thinking, in terms of, vibrations. We have vibrations coming throughout, even the reason why you can hear me speak right now is that my vocal cords are creating vibrations in the air molecules that are being picked up by speakers. And so if you think about the heaviness of vibrations being, manifest in matter as the slowest type of vibration, then you get to stones, and they're an even slower vibration. But vibrations, are what relate everything in that way. And so I think, when you come to think about, if a human being is a biological crystal, and we have this attraction to crystals, then everything that's created in matter has some kind of signature. If you're thinking of as above, so below, whether it's alive in a conscious way that we can appreciate in terms of our own mirrored consciousness, stone isn't nodding its head when I'm talking, but it's picking up. I'm still vibrating against it, and it is holding a vibration in a format of a crystal format. There's a grid there. So, when you think about those relationships, these correspondences, then you can start to understand, okay, if I was to relate a planetary energy to that vibrational grid that's being held by that crystal, which one would it be? If I was to relate that crystal grid to a sign of the zodiac, which one would that be? So really the class is going to go over finding out the framework for understanding how to relate certain astrological and cosmological factors to these various beautiful things that we have coming out of the earth, almost like the earth bearing fruit to us. And the other thing that I want to do with acknowledging them in that way is something that my friend Liv said, recently, very important that she pointed out was, we have been mining the earth so much, especially in the last, 10 to 14 years when beads got really popular. People were making a lot of beaded jewelry. And in college, I worked in a bead store. And so there was this, there were heaps and heaps of things in New York City coming, piles and piles of gemstones and cuts and things from China and, all over the world, Brazil. And you started to get sad because it was almost like there was this pillaging happening. And, I also want to bring an awareness to that and say, like, maybe repurposing what we've already mined from the earth, and, or as Liv was saying, return it back, maybe even practicing giving the stones back to the earth, and not necessarily wanting to covet them or own them, but understand what they're saying, and maybe they're actually yearning to go back underneath. Another friend, Laura in Seattle, was saying, Laura Tempest Sakroff, she's also worked a lot with these things, and said, maybe these stones don't need to be washed in light, and I thought that was a very important point as well, because these stones lived there for hundreds of thousands of years in some cases in the earth. Okay, that's an exaggeration, but they've lived under the earth. They were created in the earth, so the idea that they somehow need to be regularly exposed to light is an interesting conception. And I thought when she brought that up, that's something that's food for thought that I think we can go into.
Yeah, because I mean, I'm not really too much of an expert, but I have heard that like putting a stone in the sunlight or things like that, there's certain things you're supposed to do with stones magically or spiritually, esoterically. But really, I mean, if these things are living in a place without sunlight, in a kind of, I mean, like Rudolf Steiner often talks about, how minerals are almost like a form of life themselves. They just have a kind of a different being, right, than we do. So they have a kind of different consciousness than we do. And therefore, their entire existence is so different. It's kind of difficult for us to relate. We have to like really learn to kind of tune in and listen to different stones and different energies and that kind of that beingness. And the same thing with the animal and plant kingdom and so on. So yeah, I really love that kind of idea. Would you say it's an animist view of the universe?
Totally. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Definitely one of those. And also, astrology in certain traditions is totally dependent upon light and the ways that light works in terms of, do you see that planet? And I'm talking about, pre telescope astrology, right? The types of things that we were coming up with in terms of, can this planet actually aspect another planet? Aspect relates to, can it see it? And so you have this idea of light. And my friend Kent Bai, he talks to people about virtual reality, and he was interviewing someone, and I think I'm not sure if it's released on his podcast just yet, but there has been some research that we emit photons from our eyeballs. So when we're talking about, and then another astrologer friend of mine, Andy Garretts, has talked about the luminaries ruling the eyes, and when she teaches astrology, she often goes into that. And so, to learn that there's actual photons being emitted from our eyes that are, if you measure it on that scale, and that the eyes are luminaries, the sun and the moon, reversed depending on male or female, which is complicated, but in the tradition, that's how it was put. You have this interesting synergy between light, the distribution of light, and the seeing of light. And then if you think about various colorations of different crystals, there's atoms in there that make it look a certain color. So for example, like amethyst has iron in it, so it looks purple because it collects a certain amount of light and reflects back a different kind of light. And so, but our eyes are looking at it, emitting miniature photons, and so it's like there's this relationship. There's already a conversation just by looking that's taking place. So I think that's a really beautiful way of perceiving this in terms of, if these things are sentient in some fashion, how? And in a way, there is this transference of light taking place in everything that we look at. And we've, in the modern world, done a great job of creating artificial pigment. We've got plastics. But this was the Earth's chance to make different configurations of color, and really extreme ones if you think about certain crystals and minerals in different cave situations that will get bleached by the sun, So again, there's that question of how much light gets exposed, and will it shift and degrade something, and these various kinds of things. So.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that before, and it kind of reminded me of the sort of classical Greek philosophy idea, right? That, or sort of just a sort of a pre-modern idea that the eye itself kind of emits a kind of beam, right? Like a flashlight. And there's a sort of a kind of participation with the world. So it just brought that idea to mind.
It's actually real, I mean, they've finally been able to measure it. And I think, I think that when we look back into various world traditions across the board, we see wisdom in something that the Enlightenment determined wasn't good enough or valid, or there was no proof. But our current system of establishing proof is kind of like proof by committee. This peer review thing can sometimes squash really amazing ideas, because if you come up with an insight on something but no one else believes you because they haven't seen it themselves, and you don't quite have the ability to prove it to them in a certain fashion, then your work is just nothing. So, and yet, when you think about what was it? I also translate some Paracelsus. He's an early modern polymath. I was thinking he was talking about, again, yeah, the light of the sun can penetrate all the way to the bottom of the ocean. And there is something to that. There is something about like the ways that the sun emits its energy that does get down all the way into the crust of the earth and into the most deeper layers of our earth. And it's beyond just solar flare type things. But, he was proposing that 500 years before we had measuring instruments that could do it and prove it, So I find that fascinating to look back in some of these traditions, whether it's Greek or medieval, to see like they were really coming up with stuff that it's worth another look. Not just the astrology, but also everything else they were doing with natural philosophy. They might not have put it the way we put it with science, but they were still getting there.
Yeah, I love that there's kind of synergy with what you're saying, what we had earlier this week with Gary Lockman, and how he was kind of talking about sort of like you're saying, it goes for astrology as a sort of system of knowing and a sort of inner science, right? But the pre-modern consciousness was using a kind of imaginal, creative, if you will, right-brained. I know it's kind of a like reductionist way of thinking about things, but Lockman tries to use that with McGilchrist, and just talking about how like the sort of imaginative participation with reality and natural philosophy actually can kind of open up very sophisticated sciences that like end up getting confirmed by more of the empirical materialist sciences a little bit later on, or a lot later on in the case you're saying, like 500 years, which again is sort of making the case for why astrology is a sort of beautiful system, a knowledge system, a way of kind of relating and thinking and participating, more participatory knowledge system with reality. So I'm just sort of riffing on what you're saying.
But sure. And that participation, when we think about the kinds of proof or evidence that science wants, and the ways that astrology gets stretched and tested, a lot of these challenges come on natal astrology. So there's this imagination that somehow you're born, your biological crystal emerges, and you have your own first independent breath outside of the matrix you were created in. And then somehow this moment fixes you, and you have a chart. Suddenly you have this thing called a chart. And in the age of computers, we see this as a two-dimensional map. And it's a three-dimensional experience. It's not a two-dimensional map. So already we have this flattening taking place. And then in that very moment, we have this wedding to an ontological reality. Your birth, your very existence, now has a blueprint. That was Dane Rudyard, right? Trying to name sources of these words, right? So, but in the Middle Ages, more towards the Renaissance, they didn't necessarily have clocks to determine that moment when you were born. So people didn't know their birthdays. They didn't know their birth time. They didn't know, they might have remembered their birthplace, but the entire emphasis on the moment of birth got lost for the people that didn't have the technology to know enough. So royalty might have had access to that, but the common man didn't, and yet the common man would get sick and need astrological advice. So an entire branch of astrology got developed called horary astrology. And the word horary means of the question. In this version of astrology, if I ask a question to you and you decide to take that question on, you cast a chart for the moment you decide that question is a valid one that you're willing to see through to the very end. So all of a sudden, ontology is completely thrown out the window. My birth moment has nothing to do with me asking you that question per se, right? It doesn't matter. There is a ontological moment of you deciding to answer that question, but it's not related to my natal being. It's not related to my birth. And so in that version, and I really enjoy this hermeneutics, this interpretive problem, because you could say it's divination. When will I get better? You say, well, you will get better at this point by virtue of casting that question. Or where is my wallet? Well, your wallet's hiding under the bed in a box. Okay, so you can come up with these answers based off of this chart that gets cast kind of spontaneously right now. And that, to me, that ontological shift is super critical. It's really cool to think about. You know, how is it possible to get an answer from something that isn't related to a birth when it seems like so much of astrology is about someone's birth, their personality, their life, what's going to happen over the course of their life. And yet here's this other thing, you know, that this is a way that storytelling technologies can function, because this version of astrology has nothing to do with birth or this natal moment or testing time twins or anything like that. It just doesn't, you know. And so it's a totally different track. And I think because it's not wedded to a birth moment or this kind of, you know, fundamental narrative of selfhood, you know, I was born. I find that a fascinating thing to consider, you know, in the way that it works. How is that functioning? And how does that challenge science's need to make astrology prove something to it, you know?
It's a great point. So we actually do have some questions coming in. So I want to interject a little bit with some community questions. And the first one is from Christine. And Christine is asking, this is more specific, and this is sort of maybe something that would also be addressed in the class. So Christine's asking, what stone would I need to use for, say, manifestation, like seeking a new job? I'm an Aquarius. Does the current planetary alignment affect the stone that I would need to use? So kind of like the whole big question, right? So
Yeah.
Talking about stones, manifestation, and I guess will, right? And it's kind of, you know, I mean, astrology is very much kind of, at least how I've heard it narrativized by a lot of people who are popularizing it. It helps you kind of navigate this sort of energetic, psychic weather, you know, and how things are constellating, what certain energies to look for, what sort of influences, how to navigate that to kind of get through your day, or something like this, get to a job or manifest. So, so what do you think of a question like that? And is that the kind of stuff we're going to be exploring in your class?
Yeah, we will be exploring that. So in a sense, what I'd like to help the course do is to help people understand how to relate. So the answer to that question related to her natal chart would be, you know, let's look at what would be the planet in charge of career. Let's say it's just limited to career. It sounded like there were lots of variations on that, sort of manifesting this, this, and this. Let's assume it's just career, for example. There's a planet that rules career in the chart. You know, there's various ways that you can look at which aspects of career manifest. And so you kind of want to look at sort of the panel of judges that are involved, right? So there's going to be certain planets that are more important for certain people than other people. And in that moment, then you want to say, okay, well, here's the planetary energies I want to be looking at. And here's what signs they're in. And now that I understand that framework, I'm going to look for stones that would match this. And so we're going to be discussing what that framework is, so that then, you know, when you're in the rock shop or you're looking around your house and you're trying to say, I want to work with one of these stones and not that stone, you can figure out which one's the right one for that. And a lot of it has to do with this hermetic correspondence idea of as above, so below. One facet of that in terms of planetary magic is that the stone itself isn't just a representation of the planet. And we can do this with plants, and we can do it with other elements as well. These various things that are corresponding to the planet, like let's say, for example, Jupiter, right? We have a stone that's related to Jupiter. It's not related to Jupiter. It literally is a shard of Jupiter. So it's not the planet itself as the gas giant, but magically, it's not just that it's like this, it is that. And so when you go about it that way, then you can understand, you know, if you need more Mars in your life, by all means, go for the garlic and get a lot of, you know, red stones of certain types, you know, and hematite and different kinds of things surrounding you, so that you can actually, and iron, you know, so that you're literally engaging with Mars. You're not just, you know, doing things that Mars likes because they are parts of Mars in that way. And it's a very different way of thinking about it. So, you know, there's a sort of framework that you can learn, so that, and then this is the other thing that, you know, in general, a stone would be linked to a certain sign or planet. But specifically, as individuals with personalities, each stone has different characteristics. Is it a massive chunk? Is it a tiny sliver? You know, you want to think about all of these properties in terms of what you're specifically looking to do, and then you want to find the friend that's going to help you do that. So I think that it gets, you know, you can overthink it, but I also think there's a beauty in recognizing, you know, just like we have natal charts, different stones have different compositions of planetary and zodiacal form, so that you can really learn the complexity without having to memorize a bunch of lists. So one thing we won't be doing is memorizing anything in terms of that. You know, I mean, it would be memorizing a framework so that you can go out into the world and actually be fluent in something without having to look things up.
Great answer. So the next question is from Joseph. Let's see if I can get that open up here. Sorry, one sec. For some reason, the question has disappeared. But yep, here we go. Are you familiar with John Michael Greer and his book, The Pikatrix Liber Atratus Edition?
Yeah, we'll be talking about the Pikatrix in class.
Okay.
Yeah.
So for listeners who are not okay, so I have two follow-up questions with that, right? What is the Pikatrix for listeners who are new? And then also, what is planetary magic? Those are two words that really kind of stuck out there.
So this is one edition of the Pikatrix by Ouroboros Press. The Greer edition is another one. There are many editions of it. This is the one that I happen to have at my disposal right now on my desk. And it is actually called the Giyat al-Hakim, and it is a book of magic that was circulating in Europe in the Middle Ages, and it's got very powerful spells for planetary talismans that use stones, and there are images in there, magical images, and so it's a textbook of magic, and it's one of the core things that one would need to know if one is going to be doing planetary magic. Planetary magic is one of the Hermetic arts. So if you think about astrology, alchemy, and magic, planetary magic is using the energies of the planets to achieve change according to someone's ends. I hesitate to define magic too much, but if you're going to talk about a planetary magic, it's consciously and actively using the planetary systems that have been codified throughout hundreds of years of practice to, you know, work with whatever it is that you're trying to achieve. So, you know, for example, if it's a sort of something secret that you don't want anyone to find out about, you're going to do it when the planet in question is retrograde, because it's behind this, or, you know, like let's say Mercury retrograde. People like to say Mercury retrograde is a horrible time to do anything. You know, you want to hide for 3 weeks and then reemerge later. But in planetary magic, if you want to do something that no one's going to find out about and Mercury's retrograde, that's great, because Mercury is that psychopomp that goes from the above world to the underworld. And if it's in the underworld, whatever you're doing down there isn't going to be seen by the light of day. So there are it sort of goes into ways that you can use various components of the astronomy of those planets, what they're doing in the sky, and then apply that to whatever magical ends you have. And, you know, you have that Hermetic correspondence kind of gets you there, right? So it's sort of like, okay, here we have a situation. I want the situation to change. Now I need to call in and work with, you know, these materials, whether it's incense, stones, plants, herbs, things of this nature, that are going to shift that into a different kind of situation. And doing it at the right time, which is where some of the planetary elements come in, is going to make it way more potent. So there are tons of magic practices that don't care about timing, but the planetary magic, because it does care about where the planets are, how strong they are, and their effects, that gives you this extra boost to achieve something quicker. So one really fast way of explaining that would be, you would never plant seeds in the middle of winter because you're going to kill them. They're not going to grow. So if you want to do something quickly and effectively, you're going to make sure you wait for the right time to do it. The contradiction to that would be, well, then I'm going to have to wait forever. I mean, people have been waiting since Saturn was in Libra for it to be in Capricorn. That was a 7-year period that people were waiting for a planet to move from one place to another in order to have it be as effective as possible. But sometimes that's just how it is. Some things aren't meant to be. You know, you as a magician can't hoist your ego upon the world. You can try, and then you can just do it again when the time is right. You know, so there's these complexities that come, and it takes a very long time, I think, to become fluent in them. But even the process of learning them, the meditative process of learning them, which is what this class is going to be doing it with respect to stones, I think is a very powerful thing in terms of learning about the nature of reality and developing a sort of wisdom of, oh, I don't need to rush into doing this thing. I can wait and see and observe and get a sense of what's actually being, presented here, and tap into these things that are, present before we are, in a way.
So good follow-up question from that, I think, would be, what are the kinds of things we're going to be learning in the class? So can you give us a few more maybe examples, just more of a sense of the kind of the details? What should students expect when they sign up and join us next Thursday?
So astrological experts can expect a review of things they might already know, framed in a slightly different way. But people who are brand new to astrology are going to get an excellent foundation of the astrological framework. And if people listen to the recording over and over again, they're going to start to really solidify some core principles to understanding the nature of the world around us, specifically with respect to stones, but it's not limited to that. Stones are just the focus, and I think it's very important and helpful to have a window to focus on, a narrow lens to sort of say, okay, we're focusing here on the stone kingdom. We're going to be looking at what that does, and there are limitations to that stone kingdom. They don't grow like plants, or not at that time scale, for example. But there are certain features that they have in their own framework of how they're composed. And then we can look at the astrological framework and how it's composed. So we're going to be spending time going through that astrological framework according to the traditions that use planetary magic. So I'm not accounting for Mayan astrological tradition here. I'm not accounting for Vedic astrological tradition, which does have relationship to stones. I'm not an expert in Vedic, so I don't claim to know how to teach that. So I'm going to avoid doing that. And yet there is a richness there. So, I'm more than welcome to learn that from someone who is an expert, but I don't want to position myself that way. And then, from this Western tradition of that framework, then building out an intelligence. And then I think, once we go through each component of that framework, when I taught this in Seattle last month, it was amazing to see sort of the spontaneous eruption of connections between some people brought stones to class and they got to attend free. So everybody who comes, you can bring your stones to class without registration. They don't have emails, so they can't come in, but you can start to get to know them in a new way. And one of the interesting things that class ended with was sort of saying, well, it's almost like each of these stones has its own natal chart, so to speak. And I wouldn't go so far as to say that, because it's not ever sort of actually birthed in the same way we would be, but it has elements of various types of things. If there's an inclusion, or if there's something in it that doesn't quite fit, the standard amethyst, for example, you can actually figure out what that aberration is. And instead of looking at it as a defect, you can say, hey, I have this stone that's got this composed with that, and appreciate that and understand its individuality, and also do that then in the future wherever you go. And sort of, if you go to the Tucson Gemstone, knock yourself out. You can just, see all of these things and have this robust way of understanding what you're seeing and what you're looking at.
So I had a follow-up question from Christine, and Christine was asking about the Pika. Is it interpretable by a layperson? So is this a book you can just kind of buy and open up if you're really kind of new to all of this?
I would highly recommend reading it, but also around it, and find scholarship about it that would sort of hold your hand and explain what certain parts are and go through. And also, it's always in translation. So, we have to be very careful with translation, because sometimes the concepts aren't brought across in a way. So if you really want to become an expert in the Pika, I would recommend reading various translations and triangulating through them. So yeah, I would say finding good articles about the Pika would be better than jumping into it straight, because sometimes with these older texts, it's amazing to get the original experience, or as original as you can with a translation. However, it's helpful for a scholarly exegesis to say, okay, here's this translation and this is what they got right about that, and here's this translation and they're emphasizing this, and this is really what they're supposed to be getting at in terms of practice, right? It's a complex work. I'm actually also going to be talking about Henry Cornelius Agrippa. Agrippa was another magician who compiled. He was actually a compiler. A lot of his sources were of his age, but he put them together as a kind of like 3 books of occult philosophy, whereas intended to be sort of the occult encyclopedia of all of the knowledge that was known to that point. And there's a lot of stone lore in there, so I go into that as well. And there's actually more in Agrippa than there is in the Pika, so Agrippa is going to be featuring a lot more in our class than the Pika will, partially because there's just so much more to be talked about in that, you know, in terms of what correspondences get brought up and which traditional associations are being made, and then, you know, kind of exploring why. So, yeah.
Great. I was just linking to, apparently Agrippa has a Facebook page. I was typing it into the comments and it came up. So, okay. Yeah, should have him on. He's a guest lecture. But yeah, so I linked to that also in the comment feed. If anybody's hearing these terms and words, and if they're new, just you can Google those. You can go into those. You can as Jenn is saying, to read around those would be really good. Let's see if we've got any other. Okay, so Christine's saying thank you. That was helpful. Good. So I'm trying to think of where we can kind of move from here without spoiling the class a little bit too much. Maybe we can kind of have a few closing comments and questions, just sort of on. All right, so I had an esoteric question for you. Maybe I'm just going to ask that. So Android Jones is a kind of digital artist, right? He does a lot of stuff. You've probably seen his work around Facebook, and I'm sure plenty of the viewers are familiar with Android Jones. But he calls his style of art electromineralism. And I find it kind of interesting as you're describing like this relationship with rocks. And to some degree, so much of our electronic technology has a sort of relationship with stones and mineralogy. There's this kind of mineral world that's now kind of like getting resurfaced through, you know, technological mining in areas of the world with these kind of raw elements, these rare elements, right? So I guess my question is sort of, how do you view that? Just sort of this kind of new symbiotic relationship, not only with like working with planetary magic and stones and astrology, but also kind of this sort of weird techno symbiosis with electromineralogy, just sort of like the phones we use, the laptops we use. How can we see that in a more magical way, and perhaps in a way that you're saying that kind of honors the materials, the beings that we're kind of working with to create the internet, you know?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
does that question make sense? Yeah.
I do draw a distinction in the class between the metals that are associated with the planets and different gemstones. So, and that goes into just discussing how they're composed. And most of the elements in the periodic table are metal. So I don't really get into the metal side of things, because metals aren't stones per se. Like, you can have a crystal of a metal, but it's not necessarily the same thing as sort of this, you know, a quartz matrix, for example, or something that's a little more gemstone-like. Not to say that, you know, something like pyrite isn't heavily metallic, but yeah, so I think, you know, to a certain extent, I don't really talk about the metals at all, but I think it's fascinating what you're saying, and it makes me think of my friend Joshua Madera, who is an artist playing with sort of the interface between technology and magic. And he had a show at Mortlake and Company in Seattle where he had a sound machine that had different metals associated with the planets. And when you would touch that metal, a recording would play of how that planet sounds from a NASA recording. So it was almost like you could play the music of the spheres by touching the metal associated with the planet that would release this recording. And then, you know, you could see, like, you know, ironically, Saturn sounded tinny, but tin is ruled by Jupiter. So you have this strange, you know, sonic experience of what they're like, but you have this tactile experience of touching the metal associated. And there are other ways in which Joshua's work really gets into interrogating the interface between, you know, technology and magic, and how those things could work in a physical way. I mean, his coding, he'll build, like, you know, strange machines and you know, cut ups and different lit sculptural pieces, sometimes almost symbolically, but the code itself that is behind the screen is symbolic as well, and gives you this permutation based off of ancient texts in some cases. So, and I think with Android Jones, a lot of what he might be doing is more, you know, VR based. Is that right? I mean, what he's getting into with that electromineralogy.
A lot of it is. I think as like a general premise for his work, his art, which is basically like using digital apps to kind of create these things, but it's extended into these kind of VR immersive experiences where I think he's just trying to bring people into kind of the consciousness of the mineralogy that, you know, the machines are using to create these experiences, whether it's a laptop or a VR experience, but especially like, you know, that kind of experience too, that kind of
It also
more
makes me think
immersive.
of Dennis Quaid and Inner Space. So it's like now we're
Oh yeah.
inside of the computer body, seeing how it's generating these things instead of Meg Ryan. Um, but yeah, no, I think it's all very fascinating. And too, I also think about the interface between stones and dreams. There's been many times when I've had a dream about a stone and then found that stone in real life, and it's almost as if that stone was calling, or there was something sort of saying, okay, this is a missing piece, go find that piece, you know. And they've been pretty intense, you know. Like I had a dream about sodalite. It was a sort of sodalite cluster that I needed to find, and I was actually with Magenta, and we were at this place in San Francisco, and I couldn't find anything like it anywhere. We walked around the whole place. We met a bunch of people. We had a good time. And then on our way out, I was like, one more little thing. And I looked in this tiny bin, and it was like the cheapest thing they had. And it was exactly what I had seen in my dream. So in a sense, like that communication channel isn't just, you know, we think that they're not necessarily speaking, but they kind of are, you know, and they're sort of saying, like announcing themselves, like you need a green stone that looks like this, or you need a blue sodalite column, you know, or whatever that would be, you know, sort of. I'd like to think of maybe encouraging that kind of awareness of them.
Yeah, that's a great. Maybe this is a good question too for everybody. This is something that I'm even thinking of. How would you recommend? I mean, listening to dreams is one example, but how would you recommend kind of getting more in touch with stones and the energies of stones and relationships with these beings, treating them as beings, right? So, is there any are there any exercises you would recommend? Whether meditations, magical practices, just different ways to kind of get in touch with stones.
I tend to be pretty irreverent when it comes to certain things, so I don't really follow protocols, and I don't necessarily like teaching those. I think that awareness itself is very, very powerful, and we have an internal sense of quality. If we really, really tune into it, when we go through, you know, even if you're in some kind of gem shop or you're going to one of these gem shows where there's heaps and heaps of stuff, you are attracted to something that sort of matches your vibration, and you're not attracted to things that don't. So, you know, when you go through these things and you say, well, I want to, you know, have a stone that's going to help me with alcoholism. And then you have a list with you and you're like, okay, I'm going to get this, 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 and this. You know, maybe that's not the way to do it. Maybe instead of coming up with a problem you want to solve, it's better to say, I want to find a stone that really calls to me, that just in terms of just attractive. I mean, think of it almost like being attracted to a person. You know, that feeling that you get when you just are really like, oh, I just can't wait to see them. They're so attractive. love the way their voice sounds and the way they smell. And, you know, stone isn't necessarily going to do that because it's not human. But, you know, there have been pieces where you see it and you just can't put it down. And it's like, oh, this is a high ticket price, but this belongs in my sphere. This is something that I need to have around me. That level of attraction that just really resonates, where it's almost like irresistible. And then go look up what that stone might mean, you know, or even ask it, what is up? What are you trying to teach me? You know, what is your presence in my life supposed to do? Is it about, you know, grounding me? Is it about expanding my consciousness? You know, what is it about this specific color? How opaque it is? What color is it? Raw? Is it cut? Is it polished? Is it carved? You know, there's all these questions that you can ask and go through, but especially with the type of stone. Going in with a preconceived notion is kind of like saying, I only want to date men wearing mustaches, you know, and then you're stuck with, you know, that selection. And then, you know, what if your ideal partner isn't wearing a mustache or something, you know? So I think having that open mind and just being aware and being truly in touch with yourself as a desirous being of just saying, you know, okay, who's my next friend? What's my next, you know, and then again, caution with acquisition, right? It's not about necessarily pillaging the earth for these things. You know, yeah, I think that's, like maybe looking at what already exists instead of making a list and saying, oh, now I need to obtain this thing. And, then someone has to go into the earth and get it for you. I think that's a little tricky and problematic, but yeah. So I guess to boil it down to one word, it would be awareness. So.
That's great. And the follow-up question actually from Christine is just asking about the relationship between stones and meditation. Like, for instance, you go in a rock shop and they say like, oh, this is really good for your third eye, and this is really good for you to put on your third eye when you meditate, or things like that. What do you think of those kinds of suggestions? Or is it kind of the same answer, what you're saying kind of work with your awareness and like what you're drawn to meditate with, or what you're drawn to do kind of contemplative work with, or where you place it on your body is kind of up to where it goes, in a kind of moment of sort of intuition.
Yeah, I think that it's more about knowing yourself. Whenever I get those types of instructions from other people, the scholar in me asks, well, where did you get that from? Why that? What about, some people get overwhelmed in rock shops because it's almost like a screaming, everybody's, all of those stones are just shouting like, hey, 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 other people don't, and they don't notice it at all. So, I think, if you want to lay down in a crystal grid and bliss out and tap into, the vibrations of those crystals around you, awesome. If you don't believe that's true, that's fine. I think it's more about tuning into what really works for you, and being confident in knowing and trusting your intuition in trying that. And I'm not saying that, oh, anything goes, there are certain practices that have been proven to work better than others. And, some of that goes to even the shapes of something. So if something's a globe, it's going to radiate out in all directions. If something's a wand, it's going to be very pokey. And you experience that when you actually work with stones. You can actually feel the softness of something that is radiating because it's a globe shape. And you can also feel the pointiness of something that's a wand shape. So that just comes with practice, and just kind of knowing like, hey, right now I just need to like meditate on this one. One of my favorite stones is phantom quartz, because you can literally get lost in the tiny worlds that are inside of the quartz itself. It's a clear stone that has inclusions in it, so it looks almost like it could be a swamp, but you have that crisp, cool water before you get to the bottom of the swampy muck and algae looking forms. And I just love looking at those little worlds because it's almost like an alien world, but it's in your hand, and you can get lost in it and then let your mind go. And it's almost as if it were a real dream crystal, in the same way that our dreams don't always have like clear articulated shapes. And so you can just, in terms of meditation, I wouldn't put that on my third eye, because then I can't see it, and I want to actually use my eyes and contemplating and appreciating its color and beauty and intricacy to take my mind and let my mind relax and go to where it needs to go while looking at those things. So, I think it just really depends on the stone you're talking about, your own personal practice, if you even have a meditation practice. All of these things are just factors in that.
So this one is from Joseph as well, and he's asking just if there will be any connections with Celtic or Norse monoliths and megalithic stones, or will there be any commentary on that, or do you have any commentary on that for the class?
I personally don't have commentary on that, but I know a lot of scholars in England who work with those things through the Sophia Center Press, for example. There's a lot of work on megalithic monuments, but I don't think they do it from the perspective of necessarily relating it to astrology in the way that I'll be talking about, because I'm coming from the more planetary magic position. And, those other elements, once you get the astrological framework down, I think you could maybe apply some of that to which monuments you'd like to go to and spend time with. But the only thing I can imagine with that would be, and because we're not covering it in class, I'm just going to touch on it here. But just, if you want to go to Newgrange or Knowth or, Loughcrew Cairns in Ireland, these are places where you can kind of say, okay, this is the vibe I want to be around. And literally, I mean vibe. These are crystallized structures that were moved by humans into configurations and alignments that you can then place yourself in as your own biological crystal to create other alignments. And that's up to you. But, I don't have a rubric for going through what those are. And I actually don't study them, but I have, worked with a lot of people who do. So if you wanted resources, I could point you in those directions.
Great. So another question, quick one, is will we be learning about designing grids in the class? No. And also sign me up, says Christine.
Yeah, no, I would say with grid work, that's really more about your own proclivity. And one thing I don't want to necessarily teach is teaching people like having to memorize too much in 1 2-hour session, because I feel like then you just get blasted with facts and you walk away going, oh, that was amazing, and I don't remember anything. So I'm going to kind of go slow and steady with the astrology so that that's a real clear framework. And then once you get that, then you can take it away and you can say, okay, I want to make my chart as a grid, or I want to emphasize this or that. And then that's up to you as an artist and creator and person who knows sacred geometry, and also who knows the various stone combinations that you'd like to combine. So yeah, I think that that's not going to be covered specifically, but I think you'll improve your ability to do it if you've taken the class.
Great. So okay, so we're at 9:52 here on the East Coast, and I know we have to wrap it up at the top of the hour, but perhaps we can just quickly review that this is for our class next week. Astrology Rocks. It's a 2-hour seminar with Jenn Zahrt, and it's going to be March 15th. That's Thursday, March 15th at 7:30 p.m. EST / 4:30 p.m. PST. And I don't know about other time zone conversions, but there are links to the class in the chat box feed, whatever you call it, on Facebook, so people can check that out. And Jenn, you also do consultation one-on-one, right? Celestial Sparks. So maybe we could plug that for a moment and just talk about that just for a moment, and just sort of like what you do, what you offer, what's the kind of experience that people are interested in working with you one-on-one to specifically learn about their charts and their astrological makeup.
So one of my favorite pieces of feedback was from a recent client colleague, KJ, who said, I'm super fucking tactical. So pardon the F word, but yeah, so, she was saying, her experience of working with me was basically that I get very practical with my advice, and I love to hone in on your creative process and what is going to be emphasizing, I tend to work a lot with entrepreneurs and solopreneurs and people that are doing creative projects, both as an editor and as an astrologer. And so I'm really tapped into trying to help people find their optimal flow and when they're going to be doing their best work and how to create space for that in their year. So the year ahead, in terms of like, what's the best time to launch this? What's the best time to work with this and work on that? And, is this product something I should launch this year or next year? And also just looking at the personal makeup, if someone's blocked, helping them get out of that block by focusing on what it's going to take to shift that, or if it's a situation that's blocking, using astrology to help them understand when that situation will end and when the flow will come back. So I really do think that it's a very practical, tactical kind of situation, and I'm not somebody who's going to talk to you about what your personality is like, and I'm also not somebody who's going to see you every single week. My advice is not going to change too much from month to month. I would recommend, everybody should see an astrologer at least once a year, likely around their birthday, because that's when the information shifts enough for you to need to get sort of a re-up and a tune-up on your timing and things of that nature. So I employ a lot of traditional techniques in a mix. And I also do something, interestingly enough, with the earth. Today I had a client where we spent all day looking at her chart mapped onto the earth to determine where she's going to be most successful in business and in love. So she wanted to know where to move, where to stay, and where to also launch her products so that she could have the maximum exposure, most successful audience reception, and things of that nature. So I absolutely love helping people figure out where to travel or where to move to, and use the earth as a kind of playground. And all of it's video recorded, and you get the video immediately after our session, and it's one of my favorite things to do. So
awesome. So Christina's asking, how about helping people in the healing arts? Do you work with people in the healing arts?
I work with anyone who wants to sign up. I just tend to attract creatives. So yeah, definitely.
Great. Astrocartography, she's saying. Yeah.
That's it. Although that word was trademarked for a while. The trademark expired, but I tend to say astrolocality to just keep things in an even keel.
Cool. Well, okay. I think those are all the questions we've got right now. And so everybody, work with Jenn. She's amazing. She's my good friend, my colleague, and we're hosting a class next week. Jenn is hosting a class next week. Astrology Rocks, Thursday night. You can register in the link that's in the chat box. And Jenn, thank you so much for joining us and taking my questions, my 101 questions, and everybody's questions. And we hope to have you on here again sometime and just riff on astrological and planetary magic topics. I could talk about this with you for another hour. So this is great.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Yep. See you soon. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks for tuning in.